Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In today's video, we are going to be previewing the upcoming season for the Utah Jazz. However, before I get too far into it, I want to remind you all to leave a like and subscribe. I've been appreciating all the support that I've been receiving lately, and I hope to see that continue. Now, without further ado, let's talk about Utah. However, before that, I feel that we can adequately preview the upcoming season for this team. I think that it's important that we reflect upon and discuss the transactions that they made in the recently concluded NBA offseason. They started off on draft night by making a few trades. They swapped out the 23rd pick for the 27th and 38th picks. They would then trade that 38th pick and Tony Bradley for cash considerations, which is a bit of a trend you'll notice here. They gave up some players and assets in exchange for having the cap space to make the bigger free agent moves that they would make later on in the offseason. They also traded a future second for the 39th overall pick. In the draft, they would use the 27th pick to select Udoka Azubuike and the 39th pick to take Elijah Hughes. If they would have flipped these two picks around and taken Hughes 27th and Azubuike 39th, I probably would have liked this quite a bit more. I was very high on Hughes. I had a first-round grade on him. I'm pretty sure he was 25th on my board. I think that he is going to end up being a solid 3-and-D wing who can do a bit more on the offensive end of the floor. He's shown that he can be a solid three-point shooter. In college, his three-point efficiency wasn't the best, right around 34% if I'm not mistaken, but he has a pretty solid catch-and-shoot jumper, and he wasn't able to use that to its full effect because of the amount of time he was forced to spend playing on the ball during his time with Syracuse. So I think that this season we could see him show a bit more of his shooting prowess when he's not forced to be playing on the ball 100% of the time. On the defensive end, there's other questions about him because at Syracuse he was put into the zone, obviously, as that is what Jim Boeheim runs. It's a 2-3 zone 100% of the time, and people question how well that's going to translate over to the man-to-man defense. However, Hughes didn't spend all of his college years at Syracuse. He spent some time at junior college prior to transferring. And in those JUCO days, he flashed some ability as a good on-the-ball man-to-man defender. I also think that with his plus length and size for the wing position, he's going to end up being a pretty solid defender. So overall, this is a guy that I really liked. For that reason, I had him 25th on my board, and I think that it was an absolute steal for the Jazz to nab him with the 39th pick. The same cannot be said for the guy they took 27th, which is Udoka Azubuike from Kansas. Azubuike was a player that I was quite low on heading into the draft. I did not have him ranked as a future rotation piece as he was outside of my top 46. I think he makes more sense going to the Jazz than he does to a lot of other teams, and I probably would have had him in my top 40 had I known that the Jazz were the team that would be drafting him, because he's going to fit in really nicely to their drop coverage scheme where he can block shots and protect the rim at a very high level. The questions more so come on the offensive end, where he is an absolute force in the paint. He's a great finisher and a good rim runner off of pick and roll actions. However, he can't shoot free throws, only 41%, I believe, during his time at Kansas, which is so bad that it's going to be really tough to play him just because other teams are going to be able to just hack him every time he gets the ball because of how porous a free throw shooter Udoka is. However, if he can improve the free throw shooting, he has a great frame, and with that, in combination with the plus rim protection, there's a chance that he could work out and be a solid backup center option for this Jazz team. I just don't think that it warranted him being a first-round pick, and I would have much preferred them taking a guy like Hughes or a Robert Woodard or Desmond Bane, one of the wing options that were on the board, with this 27th pick. However, they did end up with Hughes anyways, so you can't fault them too much. They also, later on in the offseason, traded Ed Davis and 2 second-round picks to the Knicks in exchange for future cash considerations, if I'm not mistaken. Once again, continuing the trend I talked about before, where they were making an effort to free up cap room in order for them to be able to make the deals that we'll talk about in a little bit. They traded Rajon Tucker and a future second-round pick for cash from the Cleveland Cavaliers, freeing up a little more cap space. And then they finally struck by making their two big signings. They started off by re-signing Jordan Clarkson to a 4-year, $52 million deal, similar to two deals we talked about in the last two season preview videos, the Marcus Morris extension and the Joe Harris extension. This was a case of the Jazz utilizing their bird rights and to keep a player around that they otherwise would have had no way to replace, because it would have put them over the cap, as that certainly wouldn't have worked, and they wouldn't have been able to find an alternative bench scorer if they wouldn't have re-signed Clarkson. Yes, it was an overpay, but Clarkson is a valuable player who's going to help them out this year and be a very important player coming off the bench for them. So I really think that this is an okay deal, and I don't think that it's as huge of an overpay as the Morris and Harris deals were for the Nets and Clippers. They then used their mid-level exception on Derek Favors in a 3-year, $27 million deal. And I know that I have, 3-year, $27 million, I think that's what I said. Favors is a move that I have torn apart a little bit throughout this offseason, because I have said that I thought that the Jazz could have used this by bringing in another wing-stopping defensive player, someone like a Mo Harkless or the Holiday brother, whichever one it is, Justin Holiday, a wing player who is plus defensively and can knock down jump shots as well. And I thought that that would have been a better usage of their mid-level exception than using it on Derek Favors, who is a pretty limited big man who probably won't be able to play alongside Rudy Gobert. But I'm going to hold out judgment on this signing until we see how he looks on the floor this year. If he proves that it is a fungible lineup to put him out there alongside Gobert, and those two can function well alongside each other in the starting lineup, then I think that this is actually a pretty smart signing for the Jazz and something that could help them out and make them a better regular season team at the very least. However, if Favors is incapable of guarding fours and the spacing is just absolutely ruined, well, then this move doesn't make much sense to me, and I think that they would have been better off using it on another player. I get it. Favors and Ingles have a terrific pick and roll chemistry, and that's very valuable and brings a terrific option to their second unit. However, in the playoffs, Rudy Gobert is playing like 36 to 40 minutes a night. That leaves 8 to 12 minutes for Derek Favors if he's incapable of playing alongside Gobert. Is that worth using your largest free agent signing on? New free agent signing, I should say, because obviously this Clarkson extension was a bit larger. I would say probably not, and I don't necessarily know that this is going to end up being the best signing for the Jazz. However, Favors is a very good player, and he's certainly going to make those backup center minutes a whole lot better than they were last year when they were occupied by Ed Davis and Tony Bradley. It just remains to be seen how valuable that role actually is to this team. Last move they made was another one that I really, really liked, as they brought in Shaq Harrison on a 1-year minimum. Harrison is a player that I like quite a bit because of his defensive prowess. He's a terrific athlete as well, which allows him to be a very solid player in transition. Only issue is he can't shoot, so that might prevent him from being a true impactful player for this team, but if the jump shot comes along, he can really help this team out by being a terrific option on some of the better guards in the Western Conference. Well, now that we have recapped the offseason for the Jazz, we're finally ready to preview the upcoming season for the team. When we do this exercise, we go over each player individually, and I will lay out my expectations for what I think they can do this season. And at the end, I combine all those expectations and make some team-related predictions about how well I think that the squad can do in the upcoming year. When we do this exercise, we start at the point guard position. And for the Jazz, I'm going to start with Donovan Mitchell. Now, I get it. He doesn't necessarily play point guard a lot of the time, but when I do this, I list players as point guards, wings, or bigs, and I think that Donovan Mitchell is much more of a point guard than he is a wing. Last season, he was playing in the point guard spot 47% of the time, so he is basically the backup point guard on this team, considering they don't necessarily have a backup, especially after the release of Nigel Williams-Goss. That leaves them with Mike Conley as the only true point guard, and so Mitchell is going to have to play quite a few minutes from that position, Joe Ingles as well. But Mitchell is one of my favorite players in the NBA, as evidenced by the jersey here. I think he's going to be my pick for most improved player for this year because I really am forecasting a big jump from Donovan Mitchell. I think that he's going to establish himself as a top 15-ish player in the NBA. We're going to see an uptick in scoring from him, an uptick in playmaking, and I think that there is still room for him to flash even more defensive potential. The real boon that you're getting with Donovan Mitchell, though, is a score-first guard who is just terrific at playing that role. He's a great finisher at the rim. He's able to use that strength and athleticism, as well as his great bounce as a 1-foot leaper to finish over a multitude of players. He's very crafty as well and is able to put up some interesting layups, and that allows him to be a plus finisher. He has established himself as a really good player in the in-between game where he has a nice floater as well as a nice stop and pop mid-range jumper, and he can also knock down the three at a high level, both off catch and shoots, off of pull-up opportunities where he has one of the best pull-up threes in the game. He's got a great step back as well, and he's worked on his sidestep jumper and made that a very lethal weapon for him. He's a great three-level scorer from the guard position, and with that, in combination with his plus playmaking ability, he's a menace offensively, and I think that we could even see some improvement there. I love Donovan Mitchell, and I think that this is going to be a special season from him, where I think I'm going to predict him to make an All-NBA team and be eligible, or I guess earn himself that Rose Rule 5-year, $190 million extension for the upcoming 4 or 5 seasons, whatever that extension was. Mike Conley is the next guy here. Conley was not nearly as bad as some people made him out to be last season. Yeah, he took a step back in production from what he was doing in his Memphis days, but I think that a large part of that was because of the other options on the offensive end of the floor for this Utah team. He didn't have the ball in his hands as much because they had much better playmakers who were not necessarily the point guard that were taking the ball out of Conley's hands far more than he had ever experienced during his time in Memphis. Bogdanovich was a 20-point scorer for this team. Donovan Mitchell was a 24-point scorer, I believe. Rudy Gobert is going to get his fair share of buckets playing out of the pick and roll. Joe Ingles is not necessarily a scorer, but he certainly handles the ball quite a bit and is a very excellent secondary playmaker in the offense. And Jordan Clarkson also has the ball in his hands quite a bit. So really, Mike Conley just took a step back in terms of role and not necessarily play, in my opinion. He was still good defensively, and he still was a good shooter. Shot it at a 37.5% mark last year, which is one of his best efficiency seasons in the past couple of years. I still think that Conley can help this team out quite a bit, and he's a large reason why I am quite high on this Utah Jazz team for the upcoming season. Now that we've covered the point guards, we can move on to the wing position, where we'll start with Bojan Bogdanovic. I think that they missed Bojan quite a bit during the bubble, where in their 7-game loss to the Nuggets, it seemed like their offense was essentially Donovan Mitchell or bust at times, and Bogdanovic would have just given them a very high-quality secondary scorer in the offense. Bogdanovic is a terrific three-point shooter who is also a very efficient player at taking advantage of mismatches when he has smaller guards switched onto him. He's very much able to take them in the post and just bully them to get to either a layup or a fadeaway jumper, which he's very great at knocking down those turnaround shots. He's a great offensive player, and on defense, he has a high enough IQ that he's at least able to stay afloat and play a solid role for the Jazz. He's a high impact player, and it's really going to do this Jazz team well to have him healthy for this upcoming year. Next guy here is Joe Ingles, who is one of the better passing wings in the NBA. Obviously is one of the better pick and roll players in the league. At times he's unselfish to a fault, where we'll see him pass up an open layup to find a teammate for an open three, and sometimes it's just like, Joe, take the layup. But that's also a very valuable trait to have, in that unselfishness. He doesn't need the rock in his hands all the time, and when he does a great job of making the right decision, keeping the ball moving. He's also a really good three-point shooter, which allows him to be a floor spacing threat for his team, either as a starter or as a sixth man. Joe Ingles is a really good player, a really impactful player, and a really underrated player, as I think he's a top 75-ish player in the league, and a lot of people don't recognize that in Joe Ingles. Next guy here is Jordan Clarkson, who is perhaps the anti-Joe Ingles. Clarkson is good on the defensive end when he gives effort, but that's not necessarily all the time. And on offense, he makes some boneheaded plays that just leave you banging your head against the wall, because he just takes a lot of questionable shots that you are not necessarily in love with. But he also can knock down a lot of those difficult shots, and he's really a good scorer coming off the bench, plays that Lou Williams type role, where he's just a spark plug who can light it up as a bench guy. And that has a lot of value on a Jazz team that, outside of Bogdanovich and Mitchell, occasionally struggles to get buckets. He's also a good three-point shooter, just adding on to the trend of this team as one of the better three-point shooting teams in the entire league. I actually think that they finished as the best three-point shooting team in terms of efficiency last year. So Clarkson does have a role on this team as a lighted-up scorer off the bench, and he can also finish games sometimes depending on how hot he is. Royce O'Neale is the next guy here, who, along with Ingles and Clarkson, kind of completes a trifecta of three complete opposite players. O'Neale is a purely off-the-ball player, as opposed to Ingles, who is the pass-first on-ball guy, and Clarkson, who's the score-first on-ball guy. O'Neale is pretty much a sit-in-the-corner, knock-down corner threes, and attack closeouts player who doesn't have the ball in his hands all that frequently. He is also a better defensive player than either of those two. He is able to take on some difficult matchups against opposing big wings, and does a nice job in team defense as well, where he's able to be a very smart player. He's not quite the lockdown guy that the Jazz needed him to be at times last year. He really struggled when matched up against Jamal Murray, but I guess who wouldn't, considering how hot Murray was last year. But O'Neale is a very valuable role player to this team, and he does what he needs to do at a very high level. Next guy is Shaq Harrison, who, like I said before, was one of the best minimum signings of this entire offseason. He brings a special level of defense to his team. He's a terrific role player, plays incredibly hard, and is someone who is just good enough defensively to take on a lot of really challenging matchups against the best player on the opposing perimeter. He's probably going to be the guy that draws a lot of the Dame Lillard matchups, or the Steph Curry, Luka Doncic, whoever the best guard or wing on the other team is. You're going to be able to put Shaq Harrison on him and at least have him battle in that matchup. The questions more come on the offensive end of the floor. He is a good athlete, like I said before, and he has flashed some finishing ability and an ability to attack closeouts as well. The problem is people aren't necessarily going to close out very hard on him, because he is essentially a nothing in the jump shot realm, and that really hurts his team's spacing. But I think that he's a perfect fit with this Jazz team that is somewhat lacking in perimeter stoppers on the defensive end and has a surplus amount of three-point shooting. So hopefully he won't completely ruin the floor spacing for this team, but I also don't necessarily know that he's going to be able to be a high minutes guy in the playoffs because of the lack of shooting ability. Miye Oni is the next guy here, and I get the feeling that I am perhaps one of the biggest Miye Oni fans out there. The second-year player out of Yale is a guy that I really believe is going to end up being a rotational player at some point. on his rookie scale contract, which obviously is coming to an end in a couple years. So I genuinely believe that either this year or next year, he's going to establish himself as a guy who can come off the bench and play the wing positions at a high level for this Jazz team. He's a really good on-ball defensive player where he's able to use his length and athleticism to really shut down opposing wing players. He struggles a bit off the ball where he can lose track of his man and not make correct rotations, which is a bit of a flaw. But if he can improve there and give the same effort as an off-ball team defender that he does when he's an on-the-ball defender, he's really going to end up being a plus defender. Not necessarily an all-defense team defender, but definitely someone who's better than most on that end of the floor. And on offense, I think that he can be a knockdown shooter who can also do a bit of stuff off the dribble. We've seen him flash some ball handling pedigree, and he's a solid finisher at the rim. He also is a solid three-point shooter as well, and he's looked really good in the Jazz's preseason games thus far, where he's been able to wreak havoc on the defensive end of the floor with his ability to jump passing lanes. And on offense, he's also been a beneficial player due to his floor spacing ability and ability to attack closeouts as well. So maybe he won't be in the rotation to begin the season for the Jazz, but if an injury occurs, I think that he's someone that really could be ready to step in and help this team out. Last wing player is Elijah Hughes, who once again I like quite a bit. Just because I'm a Jazz fan doesn't mean I'm biased here. I mean, yeah, I am biased, so that was a false statement, but I really like these players, and I think I would even if I was not a guy who roots for the Jazz. And also, they are my secondary team. I'm a Bucks fan first, a Jazz fan second, because a couple years ago I convinced myself I needed to have a Western Conference team on top of having my Bucks as my Eastern Conference team. So I also root for the Jazz. I probably should have said that off the rip, but oh well. Hughes is a player who I talked about before, like I said, and I think that he's really going to work out in the NBA as a plus three-point shooter. I could see him cracking the 40% mark from three at some point, which might be a bit surprising because he was only a 34% shooter at Syracuse last year, but his jumper looks really good, and once he's taking more catch-and-shoot shots, I think that his efficiency will improve. I also think he can attack closeouts at high level and is going to be a good defensive player. Guy I like quite a bit. Certainly a good piece for this Jazz team to develop into a rotational guy at some point in the near future. Last position here is the big men, where we start with Rudy Gobert. Gobert, who inked a massive 5-year, $205 million extension just this morning, is one of the 4 best centers in the NBA, a top 20 player who is probably the best rim protector in the NBA, swats shots at a very high level, is terrific in defense, off the ball defense, and is just an absolute menace who can lock down the paint. Last year we saw the Jazz ask him to do a bit too much as they swapped out some of their better perimeter defenders and brought in some perimeter defenders that were a bit more sketchy and a bit more susceptible to getting beat on that end of the floor. The swap of Jay Crowder for Bojan Bogdanovic certainly was not an improvement on defense, but Gobert still had a good season, still finished third in the Defensive Player of the Year race, and I think that with his new extension, we're going to see him come out and play even harder to prove that he was worth that extension. I think he's going to be my pick for Defensive Player of the Year this year. All the defensive metrics love Rudy Gobert. He grades out as the best defensive player in the NBA, and I think that his ability to sit and drop coverage and just clean up everything at the rim is super valuable. He's also one of the best rebounders in the NBA, one of the best screen setters, one of the best rim runners, has okay hands that allow him to finish. He doesn't catch every pass, which can be a bit frustrating at times. But overall, Rudy Gobert is a terrific player. Super underrated at this point. I think there are people that don't even view him as a top 30 guy, which is just ridiculous. His defensive value alone makes him a top 20 player. And I think that he's really going to help this Jazz team out, and he's a reason why I'm as high on them for this upcoming season as I am. Next guy here is Derek Favors. He of a newly signed $27 million extension. Favors is a similar big man to Gobert, who is not necessarily the most mobile defender, but is perfectly capable of sitting in the paint and playing a drop coverage scheme where he's asked to protect the rim. And on offense, he's got a really solid pick and roll game where he's able to pick and pop for a mid-range jumper or just run to the rim and finish a lob pass or whatever it may be. Overall, just a really solid center, someone who I certainly think is worthy of being a starter in this league and is probably going to be the best backup center out there. I think that he's a floor raiser for this Jazz team because even with an injury to Rudy Gobert, they're still going to have a really solid option to trot out there night in and night out. But was he worth the extension? Was he worth the 3-year mid-level exception? That remains to be seen. Next guy here is Georges Niang, who I like quite a bit. I get that the advanced stats don't necessarily love him because he's very limited in what he can do. He's not much of an on-ball shot creator, and he's mainly limited to being a three-point floor spacer on the offensive end of the floor, and on defense, he's not very impactful, doesn't do a whole lot aside from just being a smart rotation guy. But he just does his job, and he does it at what the level the Jazz need him to do it at as a backup four-man who can come in and knock down the open shots that he gets and play smart defense. I get it. It's nothing flashy, but he's a contributor, and I really like Georges Niang for those reasons. Next guy is Juwan Morgan, who I also am quite high on. I think my bias is just really shining through in this video. But Morgan, the second-year player out of Indiana, has showcased a really solid ability to play multiple positions. He can either suit up for you on the wing or as a big guy. And although he's probably better off as like a 4 than a 5. So maybe he's a tweener, and that's not necessarily the best in the NBA because it struggles for him to find a fit. But he's a good defensive player, and if he can shoot it at a high level, then he'll be a nice complementary piece for an NBA team, either as a small ball big man or a limited wing. Probably my least favorite of the young guys on this team, though, and it remains to be seen if he can really become a rotational piece in the NBA at some point. Last player is Udoka Azubuike. I don't know if Azubuike is going to play much this year as essentially the third center on the roster, but if he does prove himself worthy of some minutes, he'll definitely bring plus defense with his rim protection ability. The questions more come on offense, where he's a terrible free throw shooter, as I stated before, so we'll see if he's able to scratch some minutes across. Overall on this team, I'm quite high on them. Like I said before, I think Donovan Mitchell is going to take another jump and become one of the truly best scorers in the entire NBA. I think that Mike Conley is going to have a bounce back year where he continues to play at a high level and is a very solid top 10 to 12-ish guy at the point guard position. I think that Bogdanovic is going to score 20 points per game again this year and really be a nice second option on the offensive end. I think Rudy Gobert is going to be a real contender for Defensive Player of the Year and will probably be my pick to win it. Joe Ingles is going to help this team out with his secondary playmaking abilities. Jordan Clarkson is the scorer off the bench. Royce O'Neal and Derek Favors improve the defensively along with Shaq Harrison. And if someone like Miye Oni, Juwan Morgan, Elijah Hughes can establish themselves as rotation players, well then this team really gets interesting to me, as if one of those guys can prove themselves worthy of minutes, then it just makes this team all that much deeper. I think that this is probably the fourth best team in the Western Conference in the playoffs, but considering the fact that I don't think the Lakers will be all that good in the regular season, I'm predicting the Jazz to take third in the Western Conference, as I'll have that video coming out tomorrow, I believe, in my predicted standings and finishes for each team. And I really think that this is going to be a team that contend for a Western Conference Finals berth. I'm excited to see them play once again, and I think that they are going to be quite good. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. How many games do you think the Jazz will win this season? In a regular 82 game year, I would predict that this team would win somewhere between 48 and 53 games. So in this shortened 72 game season, I will say that the Jazz will be a 45 to 48 win team. I think that I've covered everything that I wanted to cover, so that's going to be it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I will see you all again very soon.